Welcome back. This week we're covering the progressives, and we'll be talking about how women were able to kind of come out of the private sphere and enter the public sphere. So we'll be talking about Victorians, again, kind of quickly, but also the progressives. So last week we covered the kind of working class union people. This week we cover they're still kind of bourgeois, but these are a different group of bourgeois. They're not Victorians anymore, they're progressives, which is defined around the year 1900 to 1920. And unlike the union people who are working class and pushing for change at the workplace, these people are advocating for change, but more at a national level, particularly through the government. So just to kind of reiterate this concept of the Victorians, and maybe you're kind of sick of it already, but there's different kind of branches to this concept of the Victorian ideals. Is this branch kind of focuses on what I'll be addressing here, is this notion that during the Victorian age, you have this rise of industrialization in the United States. This is why immigrants were coming to the United States, right? Because there's so many jobs available, and they try to American corporations try to flood the market by creating too many openings. Kind of advertising too many openings without actually having these jobs available for these immigrants. It lowers the cost of labor by doing something like that. Society was in quite disordered between the 1880s and 1900s. It was a quite chaotic period. I think I mentioned this in class at one time that between 1880 and 1900, you have about 3 economic depressions, right? So our economy is like all over the place, and there's obviously no regulation at the workplace, so society's kind of hanging on by a thread, if you will. And for women really have no opportunities during this period. You begin to see by the late 1880s women going to college, getting education, but there's really no job market for them because at the end of the day, they still expected women to become housewives. So you see some, such as maybe being a teacher, or maybe like even a nurse, but that's about the extent, right? And if you're a woman with a college education and don't want to get married, what opportunities do you have? So this is where this kind of bourgeois class begin to kind of challenge that idea. A lot of these women go into these jobs too, because society kind of allows them to do certain jobs, such as nursing and being school teachers, because a lot of times it's associated with their gender, right? That women are naturally caretakers. So taking care of a child at school will be no different, or taking care of a sick person is no different from being a wife. So these are kind of jobs that were seen as okay for women to do, at least respectable women to do. But women wanted more out of life than being some housewife or being a school teacher or even a nurse. All right, so there's that. The second component here is that by the 1900s, you have this period called the Progressive Age. And as I mentioned earlier, between 1880 and 1900, society is in a bit of a decay, and just, people like the Rockefellers and Carnegie created such a mess in America, and, created monopolies and things like that. Progressives felt like, well, something needs to be done, right? Corruption needs to end. So these middle-class people who were kind of losing their foot on American society felt like it is their responsibility to fix the problems of this new money. That's very influential in politics at this time. The progressives were very bureaucratic. So that's kind of made them great for government jobs. They were very professional. Many of them were college educated. And the majority of them tend to be WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the East Coast. So you do have, some union workers here. You have some minorities, African Americans, Du Bois, for example, could be considered a progressive. But for the most part, they were, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And that's kind of important because of what I'll talk about in a little while. So for women, the progressives played a very important role in their lives because you're getting a college education, you don't want to be a teacher or nurse. What do you do with your life? Well, as they see kind of society falling apart around them, they felt it was their responsibility to fix it, right? If men created the mess, it's women's responsibility to take care of it, right? Where you see a lot of poverty, you see a lot of people again hurt in the workplace. You see a lot of immigrants who are struggling to survive. So women kind of look at some of these issues and say, well, men are creating the problem, right? Because they're their factories and things like that. Again, Carnegie and Rockefeller. Then it must be women who can address these concerns. So they begin to look at the concept of a home beyond where they live and saying, no, my home is my community. And if my community is struggling, then it's my responsibility to fix it, right? So they take a lot of things that are private, things that happen in the home, and they make them into public concerns. And that's what we're going to be looking at next, as to how they take certain issues that are typically associated with just the home sphere, and they say, no, this is connected to a bigger picture. A good example of that is alcoholism, right? Alcoholism, men drank and would come home and abuse their wives. And a lot of these progressive women, even Victorian women too, say, look, this is impacting society. Even though, there's this domestic violence happening at the house, it impacts women as a whole. So it is our responsibility to do something. So I think there's a woman named Harriet Hatchet that goes around busting up saloons on her own. She just has this hatchet and goes around destroying saloons. So that's an interesting story on its own. Again, there you see an example, right, of making something that's very private and making it into a public concern. So one example that I want to look at is the Children's Bureau. At the turn of the century, a lot of kids are dying or having health issues, and these progressives say, look, even though that might be a private issue, we can't let this happen, right? We need to do something about it. So a lot of times there were like the immigrants' children that were struggling because immigrants were very afraid of using public services or hospitals, and then they had their own kind of methods on how to raise their kids. But many of them were dying, so something needed to be done with this mortality rate. So what women do, these kind of progressive women, they begin to register many of these kids. They actually introduce the concept of social work. So if you want to be a social worker, it's actually during this period where social work becomes a thing. Prior to this period, it didn't exist. And it's actually in Chicago where it gets its start. Many of these women begin to create pamphlets on childcare to teach these immigrants how to raise their kids, right? How to take care of themselves while they're pregnant. So they're creating things, right? And it begins to grow so vast that they actually create a program at the University of Chicago called the School of Social Service Administration, which is social work. So if you want to be a social worker, the best school to go to is in Chicago. They begin to publish their own textbooks and their journals that address, health issues around the immigrant community. So again, no longer just being teachers, but now they're being researchers. And for many of them, this is a great opportunity to not only write and address these things from a scientific perspective, but also go into government and write policy. So one of the best examples that we have is the Shepherd Town and Maternity Act, where they advocate to the government to get money to help with these type of issues. So they get prenatal care. They get funds for prenatal care and infant care. They get they open up public clinics so these immigrants can come and use them, right? So they actually do a lot of good by taking that argument of the home is not just where I live, but my community, and they're kind of uplifting the community. Many of these immigrants, for many of these women who were trying to help them, they kind of looked down upon them, so they were a little bit racist to some extent. They saw their practices, the way the Italians raise their kids and Russians and so forth. They saw their traditions as kind of backwards. So they're going to modernize many of these people. And eventually, this becomes so successful that men take it over, right? It's like any other job where at first there's no money in it. Women created this market. They are successful in it. And then men said, oh, we're going to take over that. So by the 1920s into the 30s, the American Medical Association is created, and they take over many of these issues, such as birth registration and obviously prenatal care and things like that, right? So public clinics, right? Most of the doctors are men. So it's funny how women kind of created the job, but then eventually gets taken over by a group of men. So we're going to stop it right here, but there'll be one more lecture after this, so stay tuned.